Okay, we're good. We're good. Just had to close out of YouTube. Otherwise, I will get the echo.
Oh yeah, excellent.
So, I invited you on because of your, gosh, who were you talking to?
Chris
Maybe it was,
Reckhouse?
yeah, that's it. That's the one. You were talking to him, and you guys were mulling over this idea of, oh yeah, it was Chris and Chad, and you
Mhm.
guys were mulling over the idea of church unity. And so you said some things in there that, again, this gets into a whole thing that I'm in with Luke right now. You're not wrong. It's just I don't know if anyone's really thought through this idea of what church unity looks like. And then your video on powers, like how you described how you're using the word power. Can you go through that one more time? Because that was really influential in what I've thought about principalities and spirits. And so if you could go through that one more time for people that haven't seen that, because that was pretty fascinating to me.
Oh wow. Well, I'm glad you like it. Yeah, yeah. So on my YouTube channel, Navigating Patterns, I went through powers and principalities as separate entities, separate videos, basically for me. And then the way I define power is not something that necessarily comes down from above, but something that we have and grant to things, to structures or whatever in the world. And roughly speaking, it's time, energy, and attention, right? And that
Right.
sort of melds with Jonathan Pageau's idea that the world is attention, right? Because you can't put your time and energy into things you're not attending to, or at least not in a useful way. Maybe your time and energy will get stolen from you if you're not careful in your attention. But then your power is being robbed effectively. But the only way for you to understand what power is sort of your acquiescing to whatever it is structurally or procedurally that you're engaged in. And so if you don't cooperate with the police, their power goes down, right? Or in my video, I did the example is, if you want to get out of a ticket, and I've done this, if you talk to the police officer, not like he's a police officer, but like he's a human being, like you'll get out of the ticket. Some of
Right.
the, not all the time, because we don't have perfect control. And that's where we get confused. We confuse power and control, right? And influence. We have influence, we have power, right? And we have some control, but the things we control are mostly within us. And that's where we get confused about power.
Right. Right. And so I like the way you make that distinction because so in my mind, the way I've put it is there are principalities. Whether we like to admit it or not, they exist, right? Principalities birth spirits, and spirits get embodied by people. So, time, energy, attention, if you're paying that, you're embodying a spirit and you're giving power to the principality, even though the principalities are, for all intents and purposes, they are the invisible thing. They're the thing that we don't see, but we embody the spirit and we give power to that. And so that's that kind of gets into a video I did on a time management sacrifice, right? Like why that's the most important thing. It's because time management, time, when you're giving that, you're giving those three things, and that's giving power to something.
Right.
So if you're not, then that thing never gets off the ground.
Yes.
And so the way
Yeah.
you said it, I was like, oh, that's perfect. That really sums that up.
Yeah. I mostly agree with you there. I'm not sure that it's completely fair to say all principalities are spirits or spirits are only principalities. But
No,
I'm
no, no,
not
no, no, no,
that
no,
doesn't
no,
necessarily interfere with your argument.
no,
So
no, no. Yeah, because principalities can birth spirits, but they're not the same thing. They're not a
right,
direct one-to-one correlation between the
right,
two of them. So yes,
right.
absolutely. That's yeah, I'm in agreement with you there. Um, but that kind of gets into where I am. I'm not anti-church unity, but I'm not church unity in the way that I'm hearing other people talk about it, which is like, okay, well, this protest needs to end, and these people need to become unified again, And so you're going to have a church with multiple locations, and all these people are going to believe the same thing. It's like, that's not going to happen.
Well, yeah, and I don't think it has to happen. I mean, just in Catholicism, they don't all believe the same thing. Like they've got
Right.
a ton of sects. There's a ton of different, right? And so the question is, for me, whether or not they all fall under the same body. So when I've talked to Paul Vanderklay twice, and the second time I talked to him, we talked roughly about church, right? He wanted to hear about church from an outsider, and can't get much more outside than me. So but I know something about it because it's not like I've never been, right? Like
Right.
I some Roman Catholicism, and I've been to other churches, but not on a regular basis. Like, how many times I've been to the same church twice, like maybe 4 times. So, it's not, and I don't go regularly or anything like that. I've probably been, less than 20 times to churches. Like, it's just not something that I engage in. But for me, part of the problem is, and part of what Luther was protesting against is this whole idea around the corruption that happened as the result of the Pope, right? So the church, the thing that churches need to do that they're not doing, and I said this to Paul, was first you need to get together on what you agree on. Like, you need to start from agreement in order to build something. You can't start from disagreement, and that's what it is. They're nitpicking. It's like, well, when you say this, what do you really? It's like, oh, stop. How do we deal with the Trinity? How do we deal with the? No, stop all that, because the important part about the church is I have this concept. I did a video on it, and I also outlined it in that second talk with Paul. Right, where there's 3, we'll call them highest principalities. Right, there's religion, which is roughly speaking the realm of ethics. Right, and it has to go in this order. Beneath that is government, or the king, the principality of the king, right? And then beneath that is economics or trade, the principality of trade. And those are separate things, but they're all governed by ethics. But the church owns that, religion owns that. But so the problem is that when you have a splintered, edifice around that realm, it's not taking its proper role as an authority over the ethical things, right? Over ethics per se. And then what that does is that corrupts government and also corrupts trade. And so you can say, so you can look at it backwards, and you can say, well, the problem is capitalism causes people to be greedy. It's like, no. Capitalism is driven by the people in it, not the other way around. So if you put too many greedy people in the capitalist system, it will skew greedy, right? Because it can. It's because capitalism is a very free way of trade. It's like the best way. It's my gold and the king's gold are worth the same, which is a big deal. Like, it's a big change from feudal Europe. I mean, if you found gold in feudal Europe on someone on any land, the king would claim it, and it would just be his. And so your gold is not worth what the king's gold, right? Or if you acquired gold through any means, the things you could buy from it were limited unless you were the king, right? And so the gold wasn't worth the same, right? The gold standard didn't mean anything back then, because it really mattered who you were in society, and that determined what you could and couldn't get, and for the same stuff. And so that's kind of a big deal. But in capitalism, that'll corrupt pretty easily if you have too many greedy people. Well, where do greedy people come from? Well, greedy people don't come from the government. They come from the lack of ethics. It's the same with the government. The government's going to get corrupt, and the government systems, like the justice system in the United States, I have a beef with the justice system, right? So it's become corrupt. Well, why did it become corrupt? Well, it didn't become corrupt because justice is corrupt. It became corrupt because the people in it aren't ethical. Like, you have to be ethical. You need that. And so as fewer and fewer people go to church, maybe they get an idea. No, I went to university. I read a book called Ethics, and now I have it in my head, and I'm just an ethical being. But you have to work at that, because ethics changes with the situation, with the times. And as you grow, the idea of ethics changes, right? Like, you don't care about anybody else until you get in a relationship, right? And then you don't care about anybody else who isn't you and the person in the relationship, more than you care about the two people in the relationship until you have kids, right? And then it's like, oh, right. So all these things change. Like, your attention the power that you put to things changes based on the circumstances and where you are. And because there's no perfection or purity, you have to navigate that. It's an ever-changing landscape. To give Sam Harris a little of his due, it's not a moral landscape. That's ridiculous. It's an ethical landscape, and it's constantly changing. And that's why where the church needs to speak up about. The church is the one that has the language. No one else even has the language to talk about ethics. I know the philosophers keep trying, but they keep failing because they're never going to have the language, because that language is symbolic in nature.
Well, I would posit that they're the only ones that have the authority to do so. And so when we see this fractionation, right? When you see, okay, like Luther had some points to protest. Absolutely. Okay, church didn't see it that way. So Luther's gone. And now it starts this cascading effect that if there's no unified ethic between all of those, then we can't speak with authority. And what do we wind up with? The things that we're supposed to speak in authority against are now the norm. Well, why? Well, because we can't speak with that authority. It's done for.
Right. Right.
And
no,
so how
I
do you get back a unified Christian ethic so that the church, as in the whole body, no matter where you go, can be able to speak with authority and say, no, this is the ethic, right? And then everything below that falls in line.
Right.
Like how? Well, that's the big question that we don't have an answer to yet. But that's why I wanted to talk with you, because I felt like you were on that same page where you're like, no, we need the ethic. What is it? Like, you guys are supposed to help us understand that. What is it?
Yeah, yeah. So I think one way of illustrating this that sort of occurs to me is, the issue of the Trinity is not relevant to the question of something like justice. Right. Or goodness or beauty. Like how you work out the Trinity, whether you're non-Trinitarian or Trinitarian or whatever, is not relevant to the virtues. Right. It's not relevant to the things the church needs to care about. It's not relevant to ethics. It may be relevant to the implementation or the attitude that you have as a moral agent, because morality for me is the implementation of ethics, right? That's how we manifest in the world. That's why it is important that we talk about morality and ethics separately. And I have a chat with Manuel Post on similar issues around free will and agency, and we're going to do one around ethics and morals too on my channel at some point, because people seem confused about this, and it's hard because no one has a good, clear definition that they're communicating, but everybody has a different conception. But if the church can't help us understand through stories, parables, metaphor, and proper icons, what the ethos, the ethic is for us to embody, because they're too busy arguing about implementation issues that don't affect the good or the ethics or the values or things like justice. If they keep arguing about things that have no impact on that, instead of focusing on the things they have in common where they can have an impact, like, well, this is not just, and we need to speak out against it, right? The government has transgressed the ethical landscape, and therefore we need to speak out about it. And whether or not they do anything, that's a different question. But I think speaking out is really important, right? I mean, that's sort of in the tradition of witnessing. Like you have to live your truth and state it as best you can to be an exemplar to others. I think but you can't just do that in church, because if people aren't in church, they won't see it, right? But it's important that we're all signaling to each other that and you have so much in common, a Trinitarian and a non-Trinitarian. Why can't you just focus on that? Because that's where all the stuff is important, right? The rest of this stuff in some instances isn't important, and that's sort of, but there are wounds there. There are wounds that need to be healed, and so like I kind of make the case, right, that the reason why you demote the Pope back to the Bishop of Rome is to heal some of the problems. What caused the problem with Luther? Well, if the Pope wasn't directly involved, he at least let it happen under his watch. which means
Right.
the office is corrupt. And you can argue, well, you still need a head for the body. Yeah, but the head of the church is either God or Jesus. Like, now we're into theological. I don't know much about theology, so, but it could be either of those things. It really doesn't matter at that point. Now we're back into Trinitarian, non-Trinitarian, right? But it doesn't matter. Then you don't need a pope. You still need a single voice. But I think the Orthodox Church has a solution, or at least a close enough solution. And that's the thing. Like, if you just united the church on those higher level ethical stances, rather than worrying about the power structure, because I think that's what happened, is that once you built something higher than the archbishops, roughly speaking, then you get into this, well, we have a head of the church. Now you get into the corruption. And the problem is, it's too big for one person to take on. Like, the Catholic Church should have said things like, Cardinal Law can't come to the Vatican. He's going to have to face trial in the courts in Massachusetts, right? Like, that would have been a good move, because then when the Philadelphia scandal came out years later, right, they might have already had a template for dealing with it that didn't, like, nothing the Pope could have done would have been right.
Yeah.
Once he takes on the burden of this corrupt cardinal who clearly knew what he was doing and did something that was clearly wrong by any standard that anybody has, like, what do? Do you publicly burn him? Because that's where I'm at. But I know a lot of people, because I grew up in Boston. I know a lot of people traumatized by the church, not taking care of this, knowing about the problem and doing nothing about it, or making it worse in many cases. And so what do you do with that? You can't punish somebody sufficiently for that. Like, and so maybe you don't try. Maybe you give them over to the authorities. Problem solved. Like, it was a foolish move on the Pope's part.
It was. And the only way you get back to this unified Christian ethic, like you said, is like, we have to do some healing. But also, what I see that's coming out of the culture right now is, with this, the internet seems new enough that now these things that used to were only held within the traditions themselves and nobody outside of them read. Well, now we are. Now we can look from an outsider perspective, and especially with this pandemic, that's what I'm going to call it, going about, we can actually peek inside via cameras to these services. We can hear what they're saying. We can read the things that previously we weren't reading, right? So we can see all this, and then we can go, oh, well, wait a minute. Like, I agree with this, this, and this. So who can I go talk to about that? And I'm seeing some of that. I'm seeing these ecumenical discussions starting to happen, and a lot of people unifying around the fact that, okay, well, there is this ethic there. No matter our differences, we have it. And so when I go on a camping trip with a Unitarian and a Mouthy Jew and whatever Jeff is, I'm not sure, but I go with these guys, right? And we have theological disagreements, but we all spent the weekend together. And you wouldn't have known that we talked about the things that we both agreed on and disagreed on, but the disagreements didn't disallow us from talking to one another. And so things like that, I'm like, that needs to happen. Like, more often, people need to figure out where they agree on those things, so that at the very least, the entirety of the body can present a unified ethic and say, okay, that crossed the line.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and why can you get along? You can get along because you're the same ethics, roughly speaking, or close enough ethics.
Right,
And
close enough that, like, Sam being a Unitarian, that doesn't bother, because really, at the end of the day, that has zero to do with the problems that we're seeing. Is Sam not being a Trinitarian?
Right, or justice, or it just doesn't affect not that they have to match. They just have to be close enough to trade.
Right.
And that's one of the ideas I've been playing with, is that, it looks like, archaeologically speaking, that farming is not the oldest form of large community building. Religion is, roughly speaking, right? Religious tradition. So you look at Göbekli Tepe and those things, and it's like, well, that's what led to farming, not the other way around.
Right.
Because why would you farm super efficiently? You're just going to waste the food. Like you have to be able to trade, and in order to be able to trade, now we're into ethics. Like you have to have a close enough ethic to the tribe around you in order to trade with them. It just is what it is. Like you're not going to get around that, and like this is why monkey troops attack each other, right? It's, oh, enemy attack, right? That's just all they do. But the ethic is the thing that overcomes that. That says no. If I just give you something that I find valuable that you also find valuable, and you do the same for me, we can both stand on each other's shoulders and get to a bigger place, whatever that bigger place is. And maybe it's just a celebration of the fact of living, right? And because for the ancient peoples, it probably was, maybe they didn't have a language at all, or maybe they didn't have any common language, right? And so they were just getting together and doing wacky things once or twice a year at the solstice or whatever, right? I don't know. Could be 4 times a year, but they were getting together and having big feasts together, and then going back to wherever they were from. And then it's like, well, now farming's valuable because now you can start to specialize, and right. But you can't specialize unless you have an ethic, because at the tribal level it doesn't work. And if that's right, and obviously it'd be difficult to prove, but if that's right, then what it means is that the most important thing to us getting along, trading at any level, whether it's economic or political, because politics is trading, roughly speaking, trading values, right? You're saying, look, I don't want to think about justice, so I'm going to outsource justice to the group, and the group is going to set up a court, and the court, right, or a justice system, right? So we have to outsource. The world's too big for us. So if we don't have an ethic to tell us how to outsource, everything gets corrupted. And so, yeah, I think, but I think also the church structures get in the way sometimes, and that's why I don't think the church needs a human head on this planet, we'll say, to keep it, and that would do away with a lot of the problems, because it allows more people to get together, right, and have these larger, because I think, one of the problems with the Catholic Church is that a structure like that doesn't scale well past a certain point. I don't know what that point is, right? But I think that's what happened. It hit its scaling point, and then Luther went, right? And it's like, okay, but what's the better solution? But like the Orthodox seems to have survived the Eastern Church, right? And they do so without that structure. So technically they've survived longer without a schism. So maybe that's a better answer. So that's why I think that's a better answer, because then you can get more agreement on, all right, well, what's really important here? Are we really going to fight about the Trinity, or are we going to fight about making statements that are in the realm that we have the only tools? Like religion is the only place that provides these tools. I know science is trying to provide them, and philosophy is trying to provide them, and those two are fighting with each other. Science is trying to override philosophy. Philosophy is trying to say, no, we're in charge of science. It's crazy, right? But they don't have any tools for this, and they keep proving that, right? Like it's been thousands of years, guys. You haven't delivered, right? But the church has had it all along, and it's worked really well. And then church attendance goes down and things get bad. And it's like, really, you're not making the connection? The connection is that the church, we need that. We need the ethic. And that's why you need to repair this through, some form of ecumenism, right?
Right. And it's going to take a while to heal. Like we saw a small bit of it when the Vatican II happened, and the Pope said, okay, we're not going to treat Protestants like they're not Christians. Obviously, they can be, they're just not in communion with us, right? And then for the Eastern side of it, they're just like, they don't even care. Like, we'll talk with you. But they do have documents in place saying that they're against ecumenism. Like, we don't want to cross that divide. But those are just documents that nobody pays attention to, because then you have people that actually do it, right? So we're making it, it seems like we make small footholds, and then it's 2 steps back, because then something gets highlighted that's actually a long-standing rift that nobody can remember why, but it's still there and it still hurts. And so then we go off on this tangent, and then it's like, nope, done, split. And it's like, but why? Because the Eastern tradition does have something. You can be a priest and be married.
Right.
Well, Roman Catholic doesn't have that.
Right.
And then you have to stop and ask yourself, well, how much of that plays into the bad things that we've seen in the Roman Catholic Church. Does any of
Exactly.
it? Does some of it? Like, so then you've got to have reflection about that. Um, and there's, for all intents and purposes, there's a lot of things that are major overlaps between Protestantism, Catholic, and Eastern Orthodox. There is a large overlap, but it's like, it's the same thing with the news. Do you ever see the good stories? No, you only
Yeah,
see the stuff
exactly.
that highlights the bad, right? Because it
Right.
sells. And it's the same way with us. Like, we want to highlight, it's like this, all this stuff that we agree on, yeah, forget that. We just want to talk about the stuff that we disagree on. But why? Like, because the rest of the world is looking at us going, we're done with you guys. This Christianity thing, y'all had it for a while. We don't want none of that because you
Yeah.
guys can't even agree on anything. And it's like, where's the middle ground? Where do we get back and start talking about those things?
Yeah, and I think there's kind of three issues there, right? Well, one is the structural issue, right? Because if your document of ecumenism says we're not going to submit to the Pope and we don't think his word is pure or whatever, and we're not going to operate within their structure, right? We're not going to say priests can't be married. That sounds reasonable to me. I mean, so if it's like we're not yielding to the stupid things the Catholic Church did, that's right. Like, yeah, absolutely, right. And then so maybe the Catholic Church needs to capitulate a little and say either we're going to get rid of the Pope and the structure around him, because that's probably more the problem than just having one guy there. Is just the structure that's built up to prop him up so that he doesn't make mistakes when he speaks. Like, really? Like, that's your strategy? Come on, that's ridiculous, right? It's never going to work. And then you've got all these power games going on underneath. Forget it. That's nonsense, right? That's how we corrupted the justice system in the United States, right? Oh, the Supreme Court justices don't write their own opinions. Great. Then who the hell is running the Supreme Court? It's the clerks, right? It's
Yep.
the same principle, right? You can't do that. You can't go there with a system that's so big. And maybe it works at 300 million or 350 million, but probably not. But it probably doesn't work at 500,000. It probably doesn't work at 1 billion, right? That's what I mean. But if their statement is we're not going to cohere to what the Catholic Church structure wants us to cohere to, yeah, right. But and you can say, oh, Mark, you're biased because all your family is disaffected Roman Catholic. So fair enough, but that doesn't mean it's wrong. That just means
Right.
that just means that I have a bias. But the other thing is, by not focusing on what we have in common from the outside, it does, to your point, it does seem like there's always a fight. And why do you want to get embroiled in a spiritual like war, right? Because it's effectively what it looks like from the outside. Whether it's like that from the inside or not is not relevant, right? Where people who aren't in the church aren't going to get, or who got out of the church aren't going to get in if they think it's going to be more trouble than it's worth. And then and because you're focused on the fight, you're not focused on what you're offering. Like, what are you offering? Oh, we're offering the outsourcing of ethics. You don't need to take a course in ethics. You don't need to figure out like what morality is. We've got a book for that, and we'll help you work through it as a group, right? And we'll exemplify it. And then that gets back into my third point, which is, well, why is it so hard for people being ethical and doing ethically correct things and standing up in their jobs and such not? Why is that so difficult? Well, part of the reason why it's so difficult is because if you're associated with this warring spiritual faction, it's easy to pick you off and go, oh, well, that's because you're from this denomination. And that's
Mm-hmm.
why you're right. And so you're not backing up the martyrs and whatever, like if I stick up and I say that this company is not doing good things in the world, I'm going to quit, or I'm going to call it out, and as a result I get fired. That's a form of martyrdom in my mind, because you're making some kind of sacrifice there, but you're sacrificing for your ethic. Well, that's harder to do when you're not part of a larger group. Like, the larger the group, like if the church is the largest thing out there in terms of population and it's unified around the ethics, then it gives people more strength to stand up for what they are supposed to be embodying as a result of being members of the Christian tradition, we'll say.
Yep. And and that's the thing. It's like, where did, for a while we had that, and then we seem to have lost it. And it's like, okay, why? And and I would say some of the roots of it are in the Protestant Reformation, but then even after that, like Paul talks in this 3 hour video, how the church and state were aligned on what marriage is, right?
Mhm.
Very in line. And I made the comment today of it wasn't the church was fine letting the state take marriage over and govern it as long as they were in agreement. Then once they weren't in agreement, then the church started complaining that the state had overstepped. It's like they didn't overstep, you gave it to them to govern because you two were in alignment. Now that you're not, surprise, surprise, the state is corrupt and the state does what the state wants. It's like, where do you think that comes from? It's because you gave that to them. And I see church doing that a lot because and now we want to complain of like, oh, well, the state's overstepping. Well, who's been keeping them in line? It hasn't been us.
Right. Exactly.
So maybe we need to get our crap together a little bit more so that we can inform the state of where they're overstepping their boundaries.
Yeah,
And it's like
absolutely.
it's going to take compromise from everybody, right? Like maybe the Catholic Church has to listen and go, okay, the Pope and the structure around the Pope, we can't have that. Like we need to dissolve that. We need to get this back so that we can be in line with, not be in line with, but that's our compromise that we can make. Now, Protestants, what are the compromises you can make? And it's like, okay, and Eastern, are there any compromises to make? Because I'm not sure. That's the one I know the least about. But are there some compromises? Probably, right? And all of us can make some compromises to say, okay, like we're gonna stop this petty feuding along these lines so that we can have a unified ethic that we put forward.
Oh, and that we can enforce, right? And that's really
Right.
like what force are we going to have on the world as a Christian entity, right? As a Christian tradition. Well, that should be ethics, and then there's two ways to do that. One way is to have the church per se, the body that's holding up this ethic, that's containing the ethic, to provide you with a place to speak out personally, but also speak out on behalf of everybody. And the other way is by having people in those positions, right? Like by having people in the justice system doesn't become corrupt, right? By having people in the government who understand the Christian ethos, right? The government doesn't split from the church, right? Because if everybody in the government agrees, then there you go. But I think there's another problem too, and that problem is that the church and church people in general are too quick to take criticism to heart, right? It's like, well, yeah, and it's real easy too when you're picking apart, like, oh, look what the Pope did and his people. Well, fair enough, like obviously we heard my position on that already, right? And so like, yeah, but the Protestants didn't do that. Like, not that they don't have their own scandals, but they didn't do anything. Like the Protestant church didn't do anything at that scale because they can't,
Right.
for better or for worse. Right?
They
So,
can't. Yeah.
right. But, they're taking it to heart and they're saying, oh, look what could happen to us. Right. It's like, yeah, but it's like all of that stuff is going to happen, guy. It's already baked in. It's going to happen. It's going to keep happening. Right.
Yep.
So, like, why are you taking this that seriously? Because you're the only ones that can deal with it. And that's the problem. So where I grew up in New England, whenever there was a church scandal down south with one of the southern denominations or whatever, whether it was actually physically down south or it was just like the Baptist or something, right? You'd have some small church and the pastor would, a relatively small church, the pastor would come out and say, look, I cheated on my wife, blah, 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 right? And they would flip out. They would go nuts. They'd be like, look, see, you're corrupt. And then of course, the congregation forgives the pastor, right? And they would go like, why are they doing this? This is totally irrational and illogical and inconsistent. And, no, it's not. It's your only option as a Christian, right? Because if you throw him out, he can't get better, right? You've just weakened everything, and you lose whatever advantages his cheating ass gave you before. Like, it's not like the result of his cheating necessarily had a negative impact on the sermons, although maybe it did. I don't know, right? But you're losing everything if you throw him out. If you bring him back and try to rehabilitate him with forgiveness, like, that's better for everybody.
Right.
Like, logically, it's illogical to throw him out on those bases. But the guys in New England, man, forget it. They're like, oh no, yeah, this is ridiculous. This is hypocrisy and blah, blah, blah. But it's really not. Which is not to say it's perfectly implemented or anything. And maybe after the second time you got to do something different. I don't know, right? But those are decisions to be made at that local level. Like, and that's part of the problem when you try to make them at the top level. A, it takes too long, and B, everyone's unhappy. Like, everyone's always unhappy with a decree from above. That's why, like, having a pope is problematic. Which is not to say you don't need decrees, but like, you have to have a sense for what you're bringing in and why, and you have to accept criticism, but not take it, not take it to mean that you have to take an extreme action, right? And I think that's part of the problem for me with Vatican II was like, what the hell were they doing? Like, why did they do this, right? And they've already made Latin Mass completely illegal, I guess, or something in the Catholic tradition. It's like, what are you doing? That's lunacy. Like, why can't you let people do it? Like, why do you have to make it no? Why can't you say, okay, like, this is the problem when you've got a structure like this that's too tight, right? They make these decisions that are unnecessary. There's no reason to prevent people from worshiping how they want as long as they're within the ethic. And then you can worry about the ethic and the moral implementation of the ethic on an individual basis, and let the structure handle that at the bishop's level or whatever level. It doesn't matter, right? Maybe it's all the way down to the church level. The individual said, oh, look, we're going to forgive him. He can cheat on his wife 6,000 times. We don't care. We get enough out of it that it doesn't matter. Fair enough. Like, why do I want to decide that for somebody else? Or why does the Pope want to decide that for somebody else? I don't know. It just seems pointless, because as long as the forgiveness is there, right, by the people who he's affecting, and as long as the ethic isn't violated, and sure, we got a lot of work to do to figure out what that would mean, but we're not working on that. We're busy squabbling about the freaking Trinity and whether or not we can read Mass in Latin and dumb things that have nothing to do with the virtues and the values that we need to engender. That's what's important.
And that's why I get so irritated with these pissing matches superiority games, right? Because we all do it. And that's the level that the Catholic Church has been at for a long time, is let us tell you why we are the church, right? And so every decision has to be made from the Pope top down to everyone else. Like, no, you don't get to be an individual thing here. You are part of this, right? And Protestantism, what happens is, well, I disagree enough that I'm going to fracture off and I'm going to go start a new denomination. 300,000, Mark. There are 300,000 denominations in the United States right now.
That's crazy.
That's crazy. Why? Yeah. Well, because we get so pissed off about little things. It's like, oh, I'm just going to go start something new, right? And for better or worse, the Catholic Church says, no, you're not. You're under this thing. Everything comes from the top down, and that's it. How do we as Protestants stop the fracturing? We just have to say, oh, okay, you don't disagree with that. Well, if there's enough of you that don't disagree with that, let's just strike that off of our little list of things that you have to believe to be a member of this church. How about we just strike that off? We're going to put a question mark over there. Is that really that big of a deal? Let's talk about it. Is the Trinity really such a big deal to us that Sam Adams can't be in our church? Let's put a question mark over there, because I think what he can provide to this place is more than this disagreement.
Exactly.
And so then once we can start doing that within those circles, then we can scale that up and say, okay, well, what do we like about this? What is this really that big of a deal to us? Well, no. Okay. So let's get rid of that. Is this a big deal? Okay, maybe this is a slightly bigger deal. Can we compromise on this? But nobody's thinking that through. They're not talking to one another about it. They're talking past each other, or they're snipers taking pop shots across the fence,
Right.
And none of that
Right.
happens.
Right. Well, and again, like if I teach mass or give mass in Latin, for example, right? And all of my churchgoers are ethical actors with the same virtues as everybody who's not taking mass in Latin. Why do I care again? What is it that I'm trying to control exactly? Because the thing about this is, it could very well, and I'm not making a claim here, I'm just saying it could very well be, right, that one person will be more virtuous and better able to understand the ethics and be a better Christian by hearing it in Latin, and one person maybe can't does better hearing it in English, right? And maybe one person does better relating not only to the church, because you still have to have a body and the church is still the body, right? But also having a direct relationship with God, while other people, they can't get into that. And so they need an intermediary to Jesus that goes up to the bishop and whatever, right? It doesn't matter. Like maybe they just need more structure on top of them to get the message, because it's the message that's important, right? So we're arguing about implementation and delivery. It's like, well, look, we're the postal service and we say your letters have to come in a mailbox and you can only get this many. And if there's a package, you have to come in and blah. And all I'm saying is, why do you care how many delivery services there are?
Yeah.
Why? If they're all delivering the good news and it's the same good news, it just comes in different size packages. And maybe I need a bigger package, or maybe you don't need a bigger package. And maybe you switch delivery mechanisms throughout your life because it doesn't really matter, right? But if the good news is being delivered, why do you care how it's being delivered? And I'm not saying in all cases. There are a clear, I'm sure somewhere, delineation was like, well, there's some minimum requirement for how often you have to go to church. That would be that to me would be a much better measure, right? Not that we keep you out, but like the Orthodox allegedly have all this stuff, right? Like you can't just get into the Orthodox Church. It takes like a year, right? Like you got to do stuff. Like, there's a buy-in, and maybe there should be a buy-in for all the churches, not a buy-in to attend, but a buy-in to engage. Because one of the things the churches offer is the fellowship that everybody needs more of, right? And that was one of the sort of shocking things. So we had Jonathan Peugeot on our Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server, and we do Q&As, and he was kind enough to do a Q&A for us. And it's up on our YouTube channel, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord YouTube channel. And, Brett, who hosted the Q&A, asked Peugeot, he said, well, what do you think of these practices that these Vervaeke people are doing, basically, right, that we were doing on the server? And Peugeot had a great answer, although I really hate the answer. It really bothers me, which means it's good, because and he basically said, look, practices are great and being in fellowship is awesome, but what you really need is to be stuffed in a place like a church, doing something you maybe don't want to do that particular day, right, or whatever, with people you don't like on purpose, deliberately. Like you need that, because what is that? Well, that's the skill of getting together on something you have in common, right, despite disagreements. Well, and how would you cast all of the problems we see, certainly in the US, but also in other parts of the world today? I would cast them as people who can't find agreement on the things they definitely agree upon, and instead spend all their time arguing because they have no skill at disagreeing with each other, right? Which would be solved maybe if they were doing it, I don't know, in a church, right? Like if you were going to church and it was hard to go to church, or church was doing things to you that you didn't want done, just go to a Catholic church. They make you stand up and sit down, stand up and sit down. So annoying, right? With people that maybe you disagree with. But you know what? You're able to disagree with them and get along with them during the event, and maybe after, right? Maybe you're sharing a meal together after. I went to a Presbyterian church not too long ago, and it was like an 11 a.m. thing or 10 a.m. thing, and then we get done, and they're like, oh, there's food, and I'm like, this is the best church ever. Free food,
right?
I didn't know this was an option.
And that's why you're exactly right about how the communities in farming were started, right? Because it always started with the church every single time. And it's like, the church was supposed to be a microcosm of the community at large, right? It's people purposely surrounding themselves with people that they A, agree with, and B, disagree with on purpose. And they did it in church and in communities, right? That's the sign of a healthy community, is that you go and do these things even though you disagree with them, right? And but what we've seen in the West is a larger fractionation, right? It's like, well, I want to live in this state where all the people agree with me, and I want to live in this little place where all the people agree with me. And I don't want to have all these disagreements, right? No, that's unhealthy. If you're going to build a church community, there's going to be people in there that disagree with you, and they
Yeah.
should. And then the community at large in which you live, those people should disagree with you. And like that, so I agree with Pajot there. That is a healthy way to do it. And going in and doing the things with people that it's like, okay, we have this agreement on this. And like we may have disagreements everywhere else, but we have this agreement on this. And I'm going to purposely put myself in this building with you for hour, 2 hours, however long it goes on, and I'm going to be here with you. Like that's how it should be.
Yeah.
And then you can talk about the disagreement stuff, right? And sometimes it requires some compromise, and like it's messy, but that's the human experience. It's messy.
Right. Well, and the other problem is, and John Vervaeke kind of makes some of this point, although he doesn't apply it to people necessarily. But he says, two things are have an infinite way in which they're the same and an infinite way in which they're different. Well, two people, right? There's so much stuff in the world you could agree or disagree on, that two people probably have as many things they disagree on as they have that they agree on, and most of them don't matter though. Like that's the thing. Like you can always find, I can disagree with anybody. Like that's easy. Like I can just take the opposite position, right? I'm a contrarian anyway. So if you say black, I'll say white. If you say white, I'll say black. Like, I'm good with the whole thing, right? I'll go right into the argument for the sake of having fun in my mind arguing, right? But if we focus on things and go, well, we disagree on this and therefore it's important. Like, what if it's not important? Like, what if it doesn't matter at all? What, like who cares? Like, if your favorite color is green and my favorite color is blue, technically we disagree on the favorite color. Should we fight? Like, is it pistols at 50 yards for us? I don't get it. Like, why do we have to? And that goes back to the original point. Like, why are the churches seeking out disagreement for the sake of disagreement when maybe they agree on all the most important things and they can set aside the disagreements because they're not that important. The important thing are the virtues and the values and how they're manifest in the world as a Christian. That's what's important. The rest of this is just arguing to find a reason to argue, until proven otherwise. I mean, maybe it's not, but like start where you have a commonality. All stand in the same place first, and then start to figure out where your differences are and whether or not they're germane to the thing. Because I'll always find things to disagree with you about. It's not hard.
Yeah. Well, and I have an idea of where it came from. I think it started when we did have a more broad sense of unity. Like when the West began, there was, or well, at least when the US began, there was no disagreement about whether or not this was a Christian nation. Like
Right.
church and state, for the most part, agreed on everything. For better and worse, and slavery was the worst part of it, but they did fall in line with agreement. And so there was no need for either one of them to argue with one another, right? And so we grew and we grew and we grew. And then it was like we had to find the places where we couldn't have a united ethic. We had to pick apart the things that we disagreed on, right? Well, I go to this church because those people believe that, and I can't be around people that believe that. So I'm over here. And then it's just as we scaled and we've now hit a paltry 350 million, which is nothing compared to other countries, but it seems to be something for us, then those those differences have only gotten larger. And it's like we, for some reason, have felt the need to pick that fight and say, I can't go to this church because XYZ. Those people over there think this. And it's like, I can't be with them. It's like, okay, why not? Like, even if you can't go over there to that church, does that mean you can't talk to them? Like, because we're really good at that, right? We have large borders that are called states. And if you don't agree with certain things in a state, and I can fall into this trap really easily, like I won't go to that state. Well, why? Because that's a blue state. It's ran by liberals. I'm not going to go over there. I can fall into that really easily, but it's like, does that mean that I can't talk to anybody from
Right.
that place? You
Right.
know, but we fall into that mentality. We hit this dualistic either or, and we just can't do it. We will not will ourselves to talk to those people. And it's like,
Yeah.
why? And
Yeah. Well,
then
I think,
from the outside, they look at that and go, well, this is why we're done with Christianity. Those people can't even get along.
yeah. Yeah. Right. No, I think that is, yeah, they're looking at the squabbles going, why do I want to get involved in more squabbles? I have enough squabbles over here. Right. And yeah, but I think part of that is, the fundamental problem of scientific thinking, we'll say. So the way science is supposed to work, proper science, right, is that you come up with a concept and then you turn it into something falsifiable and
Mhm.
testable and falsifiable, right? So what does falsifiable mean? Falsifiable means either yes or no, right? And then that's your hypothesis, and then you continually test the hypothesis. As long as it remains yes, and this is my idea, my conception is still holds, then it moves up to theory, right? Roughly speaking, and competes with other hypotheses. So fair enough, but you're creating a dichotomy there, and I'm talking about this a lot on my YouTube channel, right? False dichotomy. We don't have very many dichotomies in the world. We're just creating a bunch. So, a lot of people say, look, when you get into a situation of surprise, it's flight or fight. That's not true. That's an incorrect formulation, right? There's also freeze. It's
Yeah, there's
three.
always three options.
Right. And then you look at like these people with well, you know what? You're either on the left or the right. And I'm like, have you never registered to vote or looked at the voter registration? Because two interesting facts spring out immediately. There are three buckets, and the largest bucket is not Democrat and it's not Republican. Most people don't identify as either left or right. That's what that's saying. So why are you making this a dichotomy? If it's not a dichotomy at all and people don't identify it as such, why are you making it into one? And that's where we get into trouble, is the scientific thinking. Well, it makes decisions easier, granted, but now you're not living in the real world, because the real world seems to have three options for most things. Not everything maybe, but a lot of the stuff we're casting as, well, there's only two options. Like we can agree or we can disagree. No, we could agree to disagree, or better way to say that is we could just get along. Like we could like, that's setting your disagreements aside. That's a third option. We don't have to agree or disagree. We can set our disagreements aside. Like why are we pretending like we're trapped in this duality, in this dichotomy, when we're not? Like we have options here. And I think that's it's part and parcel. Like, why is the church behaving like it's all or nothing? Right? Because they're not finding commonality. They're not going and saying, oh, well, first of all, what's our value and what are we protecting? Like, as a church, what are we protecting? You're supposed to protect ethics. You're supposed to protect virtues. You're supposed to protect values. You're supposed to, because you're the only ones that can, right? The religious language is the only language that has the ability to communicate these things to us. And we can bitch about how hard it is to understand, right? But that's mostly because we're looking for propositions and we're not engaging with the metaphorical language of the Bible. And like, some people speak metaphorically, and the people that are literalists can't understand what they're saying at all. But the people that can understand both, and that tends to be religious people because they're steeped in metaphorical language, don't you think they have an advantage? Like, I would think they'd have an advantage if they understand literal speech and metaphoric speech, and they can navigate both those worlds perfectly well. And, maybe they don't navigate literal as well as you might like, but maybe they navigate it well enough. But then they have this rich other world where they can understand inherently. Maybe they can't explain it to you because they're not articulate. Maybe they can't explain it to you because they've never needed to, right? But they know right from wrong. And these philosophers are getting to arguments about right and wrong, good and bad all the time. It's like, well, why don't you know this stuff? Like, the religious people seem to know right away. They don't need to be told. They don't need some complicated set of phrases or magic words or whatever to make them understand right and wrong. They're already there. They're already there because of the religious traditions, right? That's what they give you. They give you that ability, no matter how smart or not smart you are, which is really important, right? They give that to you. This is a point that Peterson made. I think it was at the end of the fourth debate with Sam Harris, where he said, Sam, this system you've come up with is great for you, but you have a high IQ. What about everybody else? Right? And then you get, laughter from the crowd. Oh, well, we have ethics and they don't, I guess, because we're all smart enough to understand Sam's system. It's like, no, Sam doesn't have a system. It doesn't work. He can't do it. He can't enact it. Right? And he's just telling you that to make you feel better about yourself. But actually, he can't even do the trick. But even if he could, what about everybody else? And then if you're not accounting for those people, don't come and tell me you're a humanist. That's not a humane thing to do. Say, oh, well, you're stupid, so you're left out of the club and you're a humanist? I don't think you're a humanist. I think you're lying to yourself. That's what I think you're doing. Yeah. But the church needs to stand up with these values and these virtues and say, no, virtues are ours. We'll tell you about the values, and then we'll work it out from there. And that way you'll have some ethical way of relating in the world, which enables you to get along at the government level, right? At the political level, enables you to trade better at the economic level, so that we're all lifting each other up instead of pulling each other down.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think the way, and here's the problem with the church giving that up, though, and stopping doing that. It's the same problem that Nietzsche posited when he said in his Death of God argument, right? Because that's what we've done now. And now the state has tried to, or has rightfully so, taken a lot of this over. And it's like, now what? There's nobody willing to stand up and inform and say, this is the ethic, and this is where we've crossed the line. And so the state has taken it over, and it's like, there's got to be a way to get that back. It's just we don't know what it is yet. Like, we're trying to formulate it, right? And there's plenty of people trying to talk about it, and Sam Harris's idea is just stupid. I've read The Moral Landscape. It's no. It's just like, really? That's the best you have? Okay. And and I like Vervaeke's work. I really do. I think he's got some ideas and he's partially onto it. And it's like, but it's going to take a lot more people really, really paying attention to this stuff and giving some effort to help suss that out. And it's so strange to me that I'm hearing this call for unity from the people on the outside. It's almost like they're crying out and saying, we don't, help us get a better grip of this, because you guys were supposed to be in control of this. And now that you're not, it's gone to shit. What can we do?
Right.
And so I watched that and I'm like, well, dang, like, what can we do?
Yeah. It's
that
more
hits
positive.
Hard. Yeah. Well, it hits hard because it's like, we gave that up. We were more concerned about so many other things and just gave that up. So that's why I like the work that you're doing, because you're trying to like point out, like, okay, here you go. Here's some language you can use. Here's things that are actually happening, and like trying to point in the direction, because you're laser focused on this is a problem. I want to be as helpful as possible. It's like, okay,
yeah,
I can take that into account.
Yeah, I think, yeah. So part of the problem is when the ethical systems break down, right? When we lose our sense of ethical ways of relating to each other, We lose our ways of relating to each other. Like now we can't, and we need that because I think Van der Klee talks about this. I think Peterson talks about this. I think Vervaeke talks about this. I'm pretty sure Peugeot's mentioned it once or twice. We look out. So we outsource our sanity to other people, right? We don't know when we're going astray. We rely on other people. So when the ethical systems break down, when we don't have a way to cooperate anymore, we go insane, literally, right? You take somebody, you put them in solitary confinement long enough, they go insane. That happens. That's 100% reliable, by the way. It might take different amounts of time for different people, but you keep people away from other people and they go insane. That's what they do. So that means that we need other people to be sane. And yeah, so for all the negative criticism of the church, now there's some positive criticism, like you guys got to do something. And the reason why the government took over is because what's next down on my little system? Government. Why? Because government implements the values that the religions talk about, right? And in the old days, it was one principality, right? The pharaoh was the godhead, right? And so he determined all the trade. He determined all the ethics. Right? The religion and the government were one back then for a very long time, right? And I think it was render unto Caesar that changed the game. But that changed by splitting the government and saying, "Oh, you can practice your crazy religion," and which Rome sort of tolerated, right, but not really, only somewhat. But you also have to give what you give to the state and just separate them out. I think when that happened, what happened was emerged from that was this third principality of economics. Before that, trade was simpler, right? Now trade is complicated because, particularly in the Jewish tradition, it's like, oh, well, who do we loan money to, right? Well, what's a loan, right? All these things get more complicated, but then Jesus splits them up, and then all of a sudden this new emergence happens. Then you get your third principality of trade. But if trade's intact, but ethics isn't, then eventually we just can't talk to each other. We can't communicate because we don't have the same values. If your highest value is safety, you're going to do a bunch of crazy things that maybe if my highest value is freedom, I'm not going to do, right? And then if you try to say, no, my highest value is safety, and therefore we need to lock things down, and I go, well, that's not my highest value, go to hell, then A, you're going to lose, by the way. B, we're not getting along. But we're not getting along over something trivial. Because effectively, if you make your safety your responsibility, and I make my safety my responsibility, now we're not in conflict anymore. The conflict is really when you want to make me responsible for your safety. And so one of the insights I had is Peterson talks about rights and responsibilities, right? Your rights are my responsibility. So what are you saying to somebody when you say, I have the right to whatever it is? What you're saying to the other person is, it's your responsibility to, right? You're imposing on them. And that's why all of these, and let's suppose it's not my right, but it's their right. You're still imposing on the person you're talking to. Like, who are you to impose on me? Like, if we don't agree about the rights and where the rights come from the values and the virtues, like what should they be? And, to your earlier point about the country, the framers were pretty clear in the US that, look, the bottom line is, if we don't all have a concept of God, this ain't going to work. It's not going to work. They were explicit about it. Not one or two, like pretty much all of them. This is not going to work if we don't have that explicit contract with the agreement in God. That's all, but that's all it requires too. And like the church can learn from this. Look at the United States. We had a bunch of splintered religions from the beginning and new ones being formed all the time, crazy ones in some cases, right? Van der Klee talks about that, right? But a whole period where they were doing nothing but splintering religions all day in the US. Every other day, there's another religion splintering off. But we survived as a country, and we even thrived as a country past that point. Somehow, maybe the church could learn from that example and say, yeah, if we don't have a head dictating all this stuff, maybe that would help. I don't know, but maybe. And maybe if we can agree on the things we agree on, like God is the highest thing, and that's where we're getting our virtues from, and here are the virtues, and here's roughly how we think that you translate them into values, and then there's the book that teaches you how to enact the values. Well, fair enough, right? Like that's, and then we don't need then we don't need to get crazy with Vervaeke language, because I agree that some of the Vervaeke language is a little crazy, but it's useful. It's a useful illustration, right? It's
Yes.
no matter how much language you have, you're not going to solve justice, right? And Vervaeke's clear about this too. Like when you're talking about virtues, there's no solution. You don't get, right? That's why his dialogos practice is all about, you talk about a virtue. Why? Because there's no right answer. You're not coming out of it as a debate, because no one's going to win the virtue debate. It's not going to happen, because you can't describe these things in language. Like there's a deep philosophical tradition starting with Plato. It says you're not going to get around these things in language, and that's okay. You don't need to.
No, the way you get around them is they're acted out, right?
Exactly.
And so that's the biggest thing is it's not that nobody's talking about it, it's that they're not acting it out. They're not modeling it, right? And so
Exactly.
that's always been a big thing in any of the churches I've ever went to. It's like, oh, you want to see how much things can change? Just model it. Just
Yeah.
be the exemplar of it. So whatever is talked about inside the building, it's like, okay, that's fine, but I can give you example after example of multiple denominations getting together when there's disasters and just acting it out. Well, what does
Right.
that do? You know, it's like for that community, that does way more than sitting and talking about things. You've acted out the ethic. And
Or the
so that
government.
informs the ones standing outside watching, like, oh, this is the ethic. It's like, do more of that,
Yeah.
embody it and act it out. And then you do have to go back and talk about the things that are keeping you distant from one another. But as long as you go out and you're acting that out and you're informing the ethic, then it's like that's a start. That's a step in the right direction. Then we get to have the discussion about it, afterwards. But that's a step in the right direction. It's just sad that it takes natural disasters to see that kind of stuff, you know?
Right. Well, they have it, to your point, exemplified, and I think that was one of the things that we lost. And I think the Republicans kind of ceded that ground, right, and sort of changed the way charity works in the United States. And now the church isn't quite as involved. And so, I talked to Chris Petkow, my second talk with him. I think we talked about, all of the hospitals in the state that I moved to, South Carolina, were run by religious orders. All of them. All of them. You didn't need insurance. You didn't, like, you could just go there and they wouldn't take your house. Like, and now we've moved to a worse situation because we've made them all corporate or government. And
Yep.
so, and we know government you can argue all day long about other countries. In the United States, we always had, prior to the passage of the law of the ACA law, we had two free healthcare systems. Two entire free healthcare systems. They both sucked. Everybody complained about them constantly. Why do you want to make the government just seems bad at this, guys? It just seems bad at it. It's not a ding. Like, government's not supposed to do everything for you. Like, that's the whole thing, right? The church is supposed to do a bunch of stuff too, right? And so that was sort of the beginning of the end to some extent, right? Because now you don't have that. And we need that. Because I can't go to the hospital and have people asking me stupid questions about whether or not I'm in pain when I'm literally passing out. You don't need to ask that question. Stop being a robot. Like, you don't need to ask that question. You can see me. I'm right in front of you. I'm passing out. I'm obviously in pain. Give me some drugs, because that's your only solution. Like, if that's not your only solution, then whatever. But like, that is their only solution. Well, then push the damn drugs. That's what to some extent, that's what I'm there to get better. And if you need to talk to me, you're going to have to do that, right? Because I can barely talk when I'm busy passing out from pain. Like, it's so hard for the government to do that because they have to proceduralize and formalize and bureaucratize everything so that it's all bureaucratized, and everything takes forever. It's like, no. When people are in trouble, they need help, right?
Yep.
And they need people to help them. And if those people are just Christians who help using whatever means they have, we're better off, because then we don't have to check boxes and tick forms and fill out stuff and have insurance that we've been paying for forever that we get nothing out of. And, like, all of those structures go away. They're less efficient structures. Like, why don't you want more efficiency? The most efficient thing is to have compassionate, caring people running your hospitals so that they're not little robots just, taking, 20 minutes to decide whether or not to give you painkillers when you obviously just need some painkillers so that other things can happen. Because if you're just in pain, half passed out, they can't treat you because they don't know what the hell's wrong with you. Right.
And
So,
yeah, and you can't articulate it. And
right.
much to the chagrin of other denominations, I would I would venture to say probably all those hospitals were from Catholic churches
Yep.
because
Probably.
that's what they do. And why does the government not see that as beneficial? Why do they not go, we don't have to we don't have to touch this. Like these people over here, these crazy people we call Christians, they want to do this. So let them,
Yeah.
right? It comes
Right.
same thing with like disaster relief. It's like, do we really need FEMA? No, because if you mobilize the churches, they'll take care of everything for you. So it's like,
Exactly.
why don't we do that? And then churches, why are you ceding so much ground to the government and not saying, no, 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 that's not your job. That's our job. You stay over here and you do the only things that you're good at, and we'll go take care of that because that's not your job.
Exactly.
That's
And you
out.
can make an efficiency argument, right? But the problem is everybody wants control. They're like, oh, the churches are imperfect and I can make perfect. But the word perfect is just the word purity translated into science language.
Yeah.
Like when you say perfect, all you're saying is purity within the science church. That's all
Yeah.
you're saying. And it's like, well, yeah, I want perfection too or purity too. Absolutely. But I'm realistic and that ain't going to happen. And
Yeah.
so I'm still striving for the ideal, right? I'm still going for, well, what's the best thing we can possibly do? Maybe it's forgive the pastor after he's already transgressed. I don't know. Seems that way to me, right? And maybe it's oh, well, this person did this bad thing, but if we don't drag them back in, they're only going to get worse because that's how that works, right?
Yep.
Maybe maybe that's it. Like maybe Jesus was right. I don't know. Like it's been working for a couple thousand years. Maybe the guy was onto something.
Who knows? Maybe. Yeah. And that's what got me about listening to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast too. It's like you get to the very end and you find out they actually just wanted to like get people around Mark Driscoll that were older and knew better and could kind of, and so even at the end they weren't firing him. They were trying to uh what's a good word? They were trying to give him some discipline and really just say like, okay, this thing's gone off the rails, Mark. We want to forgive you as a church. We want you to continue to be here, but there's some things that got to change. And he wasn't willing to do that. And that's where Jesus was right about that. It's like for all the scandals of the Catholic Church, if they would have let those things be dealt with in the court, in the justice system that we already had, maybe there could have been some restoration there.
Yeah.
There could have been, because then they could have said like, okay, we left this to the authorities. We've understood that that's their job now because this goes beyond the church and this happened in a community. So like that has to be dealt with there.
Well,
But
and it would have been great for them because if anybody's unhappy, they can't be unhappy with the church. The church didn't do it, right?
right,
And if the church is unhappy, well, then it's a clear lines that they're not doing their work. Like the justice system, which flows from the ethical system that the church is responsible for, is failing. Well, how do we, as the ethical authority, help to fix that? Well,
right,
good freaking question, because that's the question I'm asking every day. Where are these people? Like I've been wronged, clearly wrong. There's no argument. Like there's court documents and stuff. Like stuff that happened is ridiculous. It's absurd. I could go on all day about it, but like having a house stolen from you from a company that you've never done business with ever in your life is absurd. Why
yeah,
is that a thing? And then going through a 5-year lawsuit to cede it to them on a lie. They lied on evidence that was never presented, that I never saw because it doesn't exist, by the way. Why is this possible? Why is it possible for some strange random bank in another country to steal property that isn't theirs, and clearly that they never had any interest in? Like, why is this possible? Right? Why is it possible for somebody to steal my mother's estate and under the nose of the court, right? Which should know better. Like, well, they don't even have the documents. The court's not even following their own rules. Like, this is what happens with government corruption, right? They don't follow their own government rules. Well, now you've nothing to rely on. And granted, nobody wants to hear this, right? Granted, I don't want to say it, but it's a crisis. Like, if you have to go to court, you're in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. And so to fix the justice system, first you have to fix the church, because they are the ones who are
right
responsible for giving the ethic to the justice system.
Exactly.
And then it flows downhill into the trade, just like you said. And it makes complete sense. It's just, it's going to take a long time to unravel it all. And,
maybe.
we have to, well, it may not take as long as, yeah.
I don't think it has to take that long. It just has to take really drastic change, really painful change, really painful, like ridiculous. But it's like the pain's going to go up as time goes on, right?
But is the pain worth it? Is the pain worth it to pass on a better world?
Right. Right. You have to make the sacrifice. And even though it's hard.
Hurt. Yeah. And it's going to hurt. But you know what? We have the microcosm of that already, right? Because that's getting married and starting a family.
Yeah.
That's expanding and building a community, because it's painful to build a community, because then it's open and people that you disagree with can move in, right? So that's building a community. And then it scales up. And so at every level, it's pain. Yeah. At every level is painful.
Right.
But is it worth it? Yes.
Right.
So it's we're going to have to go through those pains.
Well, and there's a bigger problem. Like, people don't get it. Like, when the train is out of control and going downhill, it only goes faster.
Yeah.
And it's still going to crash. So the question is, do you crash it now and have fewer casualties, or do you crash it later and have more casualties? That's really what we're arguing about at this point. Yeah. That's really what we're arguing about. We're arguing about fewer casualties or more casualties. And by delaying, we're creating more casualties. And I'm not a fan of that. I just think that's bad. Like, I maybe I don't know what the good is, but I know that's bad. Let's not do that. Let's crash the train now. Let's crash the train as hard as we can. And let's get this over with as quick as we can, because things are bad. Like, things are really, really bad. And you don't want to get caught in these systems where there's no reliability. You can't rely on the justice system. The only way to get justice is to get it yourself. That's not a good option, but that's where we're getting to. And we're closer than anybody realizes. We are one step away at most. And once things break down, they break down really quickly. There's a good example. I know, I don't know if it was Frontline or Nova, one of the PBS thingies. They did a 10-year retrospective on the Ugandan genocide. However, whatever year that was, you can look it up online. And one of the things they said was, well, sure, it was a genocide. Absolutely. But the problem is, once a genocide starts, people in their own village who are of the same tribe, they say, like, well, you know what? My neighbor pissed me off, so I'm going to kill him, and I'm going to blame the genocide for it. Right? Like, it just, like, everybody's behavior degrades. Right? Once the killing starts, everybody's behavior degrades. So it's not the genocide that killed people. People just had grudges against their own tribes, and nowhere near where the genocides were actually occurring. And then like just the murder rate goes up, like, tremendously overnight. That's the problem. And that's the thing. Like, these things degrade very quickly. And we're not that far away with all the riots and everything else, right? Like, and it was protests all over the place, right? France, would they have years of protest? Is that even over? I don't know, right? Like, this is not a good situation to be in, because this is going to get really bad really fast. And when it gets bad, it's going to get bad. It's not going to stop in the middle. It's not a linear progression, right? It's going to just fall off the cliff. And that's why we need to pull the church up quick, because the church is still doing this. The church has to start doing this. And that's going to be painful. I don't care what set of solutions you think you have to implement them yesterday. Like, yesterday. Like, this is not a good situation. Our loss of the ability to talk is due to our lack of ethics. We can't talk because we don't have ethics, and ethics point us to what's important. And if we don't know what's important, we'll argue over something stupid like safety. We'll argue over something stupid like race. We'll argue over something stupid like theories that aren't even necessarily real. They're just someone's crazy idea. Like, I don't want to argue over theories. Why are we arguing over theories? Why are we arguing over possibility? Why are we arguing over game A, game B? Like, are you lunatics? Like, let's argue over something important, like whether or not we're even able to talk to each other civilly. That would be good to figure out, right? And then what do we have in common? How can we cooperate to make things better? Let's argue about that. Right? Let's have a debate about how we can cooperate to make the world a better place. What can we do to make ourselves better? These are good discussions to have. Let's just discuss that and not discuss anything else. But you know, we need the church to do the same thing. Let's get together and argue about how we can manifest the good in the world in a Christian way. Yeah, let's do that, churches. Let's all the churches go. Let's call a freaking council tomorrow and just get everybody in the room. Like, why not? And we can televise it, and they'll have no choice. Some people will watch, televise it, stream it on YouTube, whatever. Like, now, the part of the problem is the churches have been beholden, and everybody has, to the media. And the media, the mainstream media, got corrupt. And fine, fair enough. They've got their lenses because they're all postmoderns, right? Fine, that's fine. But now, Tim Pool has more viewers than CNN. Right? We're not beholden to these idiots anymore. We're not beholden to these institutions anymore. The fourth estate has fallen. That happened a long time ago. You didn't notice. I get that. But it already happened. Now, the churches have the ability to take control of some of these situations, as you alluded to before. Now you can just see what churches are doing. It's like, oh, that's not so bad. I thought those Presbyterians were evil and, like, you know, burn the Catholics when they found them or something. I don't know. I don't know what Presbyterians do.
Right. It's always the more information. It's always the more information. Like, we don't want to limit it. We don't want to have a limited bandwidth. We want to be able to see, like, oh, that's what they do. And the more we have that, then I'm 100% with you. Ecumenical council, like yesterday, to resolve some of this stuff. Because it's like, some of this is so far back and so ignorant that why are we even talking about it at this point? Like, really? And then some of it's like, okay, yeah, you know, that's still crossing a line. But some of it's so far back, it's like, why are we even arguing over it? And is this causing us to not, is this breakdown in communication causing us to not be able to speak with authority into the rest of the world?
Yeah, it is.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Stop.
Right.
Like, draw the line and stop.
Stop the disagreement. Yeah, no, absolutely. Because if it's just like I said, if it's just like, well, look, according to the church, you know, we're going to put down this decree. You can't read mass in Latin. Why? Why do you care about that? What possible reason could you have to even think that that is an important task of the church? Like, really? Like, guidelines for what you should do or the best way to do it, sure, but keep it as fuzzy as possible, because every community is going to have different things that they need in the moment. So don't get all tyrannical about it. Like, what are you doing this for? This is nuts. Right. And yeah, sure, some churches should be orthodox and should say, you've got to do a year of suffering to get in here, buddy. Absolutely. And also, I mean, I talked with Paul about this in my second talk with him. You know, I said, look, you need the monasteries back, guy. You need it. Yeah. Why? Because they're the exemplar of the extreme version of the aesthetics that you're talking about. Right. That way, maybe you don't need to have priests not get married. Right. Because if you want to see, right, and that pulls the church back towards virtues, right? Because to have monasteries, to have virtuous people living virtuous lives in the extreme case gives contrast, and it pulls the church back, because the church has to be pulled towards the people. And if the people sort of get this postmodern idea in their head, or whatever idea of the week it is, or whatever philosophy comes along, right, then they're going to pull the church in that direction. And that's fine. Like, maybe some of that needs to happen, but you need to have an anchor on the other side to pull the church back to, no. What are the aesthetics? What are the minimum things? What are the good, and how does it work? Like how do monasteries work in the modern world? I don't know. Like, I haven't been to a modern, Christian monastery. I don't know what that looks like. I would like to. I would think that would be helpful for everybody to know. And now that we're not beholden to the media to get the message out, to spread the good word, right? We can stream it on YouTube. We can show our what we're doing live, and it's more about, oh, I see these bad things, right? And I have to be tuned to bad things because evolution, fair enough. But if you don't see the bad things and you start seeing the good things and you realize, oh, well, there's just a lot of good here, maybe you can move towards that, right?
Yeah.
Like, give me something to move towards. I need to move towards something. I'll know roughly if it's good for me, right? But it's got to be good. Like, you got to start from goodness. And yeah, people aren't starting from that premise. Like, what's good? Is being good? Because I think being is good. And if being is good, that gives us a place to have ecumenism. Like, okay, being is good. Everybody, all the Christians agree, right? That would be a big step, because a lot of people are moving to Gnosticism and mysticism and all this other stuff. And I mean, why? Right? And then you've got Vervaeke and Peterson, and I argue they're trying to make this neutral, being is neutral, middle out argument. It's middle out. It's like, well, we're going to stand on objective material reality. We're going to argue that we can argue our way to the good by standing in the middle. And I'm like, no, you can't. No. But why? Why are you doing this? You don't even need to do this. You can just embody the good. We have a book. It's a couple thousand years old. Somebody should read it someday. Maybe
Right.
it'll tell you something.
And just say, okay, being is good. Now let's extrapolate out from there, right? And that's the main thing that people need to get. It's like, we just need to point them in a general direction. And then there should be other people out there that are engaging with them. And then as they're talking through their ideas of like, oh, I think this about this, then you can kind of direct them in a direction like, oh, okay, well, you're probably a little bit more Catholic, so there's this route, or you're a little bit more this, so there's the, and then they get plugged into a community in one of those churches, and bam, instant shift. Like, things begin to change that quick.
Everything gets better for everyone, right? Communities lift each other up, right? The community, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And every part you add adds to the advancement of the community, roughly speaking. Is that true in all cases? Well, it's not exactly true in all cases, but it's true enough in most cases that that's the best available answer. Always go with the best available answer. Then you're not striving for perfection or purity or whatever, right? Strive for better. That's an easy one.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to end it. But I would like to do this again so we can keep talking through these things whenever, we don't have to schedule anything right now, just sometime in the future.
Anytime, Charlie. Well, you saw the video, right? Like, if somebody says they want to talk to me before they finish saying what they want to talk about, I say yes. Why? Because they think they can get something out of me. And if that's true, I should just believe them, because I don't know, and just engage. So I'm always happy to engage.
Well, thank you. And I'll talk to you later, brother.
Thank you. Have a lovely day.